September 7, 1940, 8:47 p.m., London. The sound comes first, a deep mechanical drone that grows louder with each passing second. Then the sirens. Families scramble into Anderson shelters buried in their backyards. Mothers clutch children. The elderly press hands over ears. Above, searchlight beams slice through the darkness, hunting for shadows that move faster than light can follow. The Heinkel HE-111 bombers arrive in perfect formation, each one guided by invisible radio beams transmitted from occupied France. The pilots don't need to see London. They don't need maps. They simply follow the signal, two intersecting beams that meet precisely over their target. Tonight, it's the East End docks. Tomorrow, it could be Coventry. Next week, perhaps Manchester. The bombs fall. Warehouses explode. Flames paint the Thames orange. For the Luftwaffe, this is the future of warfare. Precision bombing in total darkness, unstoppable and inevitable. But deep beneath the streets of London, in a secret room at the Air Ministry, a small group of scientists and intelligence officers are listening. They hear every transmission. They know every frequency. And they are about to turn Germany's greatest weapon into its own trap. This is the story of how Britain fought back, not with bullets, but with phantom signals that rewrote reality itself. If you love stories where ingenuity defeats raw power, hit subscribe. You won't want to miss what happens next. To understand how Britain turned the tide, we must first understand what they were facing. By the summer of 1940, Nazi Germany had conquered most of Western Europe. France had fallen. Britain stood alone. Hitler's Luftwaffe commanded the skies, and Hermann Göring promised his Führer that London would burn. But night bombing presented a problem even for the mighty Luftwaffe. In darkness, without visual landmarks, how could bombers accurately strike industrial targets? The solution was Knickebein, German for crooked leg, a radio navigation system developed by Telefunken before the war. The concept was elegant. Two powerful radio transmitters on the European coast would broadcast narrow directional beams. A bomber flying along one beam would hear a steady tone in the pilot's earphones. When the aircraft reached the intersection with a second beam, the pilot knew exactly when to release bombs. No guesswork, no error, just mathematical certainty. The British knew nothing of this technology until June 1940, when RAF intelligence officer Dr. Reginald Victor Jones received a cryptic report. A downed German bomber's wreckage contained unusual radio equipment. Prisoner interrogations mentioned mysterious beams that guided them to targets. Most senior officers dismissed it as impossible. Radio beams couldn't be that precise, they argued. The wavelengths would be too wide, the technology too complex. But Dr. Jones believed otherwise, and he was right. Dr. R.V. Jones was only 28 years old, but his mind worked with the precision of the instruments he studied. A physicist by training, he had been recruited into RF scientific intelligence because Britain desperately needed people who understood the invisible world of radio waves and electromagnetic frequencies. In his cramped office, Jones pored over prisoner interrogations, reconnaissance photographs, and intercepted German communications. The evidence was fragmentary, but patterns emerged. German bomber crews spoke of following beams. They mentioned specific radio frequencies. They referenced a targeting system that worked in any weather, day or night. Jones realized that if Germany truly possessed such technology, Britain's defense was obsolete. Searchlights were useless. Anti-aircraft fire was guesswork. Radar could track aircraft but couldn't stop them from hitting their marks with deadly accuracy. He presented his findings to Churchill's scientific advisor, Frederick Lindemann, who brought the matter directly to the Prime Minister. Churchill, ever the strategist, grasped the implications immediately. If the Germans had weaponized radio navigation, Britain needed to do more than understand it, they needed to corrupt it. On June 21, 1940, Churchill ordered an urgent investigation. That very night, a specially equipped Avro Anson aircraft took off with Dr. Jones aboard, hunting for German radio beams over England. They found them within hours. Knickerbein was real, and London was in its crosshairs.
The discovery changed everything. The Anson's radio operator, using specialized detection equipment, picked up the first beam at exactly 30 megahertz, a frequency the Germans believed was too high for the British to monitor effectively. The beam was narrow, focused, and pointed directly at the Rolls-Royce aircraft engine factory in Derby. Jones's team worked through the night, mapping the beam's characteristics. They discovered it originated from a transmitter near Cleve, Germany, and was powerful enough to reach deep into British airspace. More alarming still, there were multiple transmitters scattered across occupied Europe, each capable of guiding bombers to different targets. But Jones also noticed something crucial. The system's weakness lay in its elegance. The Knickerbein beam transmitted Morse code dots on one side of the beam and dashes on the other. When perfectly centered, pilots heard a steady tone. This meant the entire system depended on precise radio frequencies and timing. If Britain could broadcast on the same frequency, if they could inject false signals into the beam, they might bend it, distort it, make it lie. This was born Operation Headache, later codenamed Aspirin, Britain's first organized electronic countermeasure campaign. The invisible war had begun, fought not in the skies, but in the electromagnetic spectrum itself. And Germany had no idea they'd been infiltrated.
Building the countermeasures required unprecedented speed and secrecy. British engineers, working from a facility in Worcestershire, constructed transmitters powerful enough to interfere with German signals without being so obvious as to reveal the deception. The challenge was surgical precision. Too much interference and the Germans would simply switch frequencies or abandon the system. Too little and bombers would still hit their targets. The solution was meakening, rebroadcasting the German navigation signals with slight distortions. British operators would receive the Knickerbein beam, then retransmit it at slightly altered angles or with minute timing delays. German pilots, hearing what sounded like their guidance system, would unknowingly follow corrupted instructions. By August 1940, the first countermeasure stations were operational. RAF-WI service intelligence operators monitored German radio communications around the clock, listening for any indication that the deception had been noticed. They tracked bomber formations, predicted targets, and coordinated with the electronic warfare teams to bend beams away from cities and toward empty countryside. The operation required perfect coordination. If a British transmitter activated too early, German crews might detect the interference. If activated too late, bombs would already be falling. The stakes were absolute. Every night, civilians slept unaware that their survival depended on scientists manipulating invisible electromagnetic waves in a war Germany didn't yet know it was losing. The Luftwaffe was about to learn a terrible lesson about overconfidence. September 14, 1940. The night Britain's invisible defense went fully operational. Luftwaffe bombers took off from airfields in France and Belgium, their crews confident. Intelligence had assured them British defenses were crumbling. The Knickerbein system had proven flawless in previous raids. Tonight's target? Southampton's shipping facilities, a critical supply port. The lead navigator tuned to 31.5 megahertz. The familiar steady tone filled his headphones. He adjusted course, following the beam with textbook precision. Below, searchlights swept uselessly through clouds. Anti-aircraft fire burst at random altitudes. The British were blind, just as expected. But in a sealed room beneath the countryside, British operators had already identified the bomber stream's frequency. With a simple switch, their transmitter came alive. The counterfeit beam, identical in every measurable way to the original, began broadcasting. The German navigator noticed nothing. Why would he? The tone remained steady. The signal strength was perfect. His instruments showed no deviation. What he couldn't know was that the beam was now bending, just 3 degrees off true heading. Not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to matter. 10 minutes later, the formation reached what their instruments indicated was Southampton. Bomb bay doors opened. High explosives tumbled into darkness. They struck empty farmland 15 miles from the actual target. Cows scattered. Craters appeared in fields. Not a single ship was touched. Not a single dock damaged. Somewhere, R.V. Jones smiled. The Germans didn't understand what was happening, not at first. Mission reports became increasingly bizarre. Experienced crews swore they'd followed protocol exactly, yet bombs consistently missed their marks. Photographs taken during bombing runs showed the wrong terrain. Industrial targets remained intact while surrounding countryside bore crater patterns that made no tactical sense. Luftwaffe intelligence officers suspected sabotage, not of their aircraft, but of their navigation equipment. Perhaps British spies had infiltrated German research facilities. Maybe the transmitter stations themselves were compromised. The truth was far simpler and more devastating. The British weren't sabotaging German equipment. They were simply speaking the same language fluently enough to lie in it. As autumn progressed, British electronic warfare became more sophisticated. The original aspirin system evolved. Engineers developed bromide, which could jam the more advanced Excaret system, a precision targeting device that used 3 intersecting beams and timing mechanisms. Excaret was supposed to be unjammable. German scientists had specifically designed it to counter British countermeasures they assumed might eventually appear. The system used multiple frequencies simultaneously, cross-checked timing with built-in clocks, and employed sophisticated error checking. Dr. Jones's team cracked it in 3 weeks. They didn't jam it. They didn't overwhelm it. They simply fed it data that passed every error check while subtly, invisibly steering bombers away from real targets. The electromagnetic war was escalating, and Britain was winning. November 14, 1940. The night Germany decided to prove their systems still worked. The target was Coventry, a medieval city with modern industry, producing aircraft engines, munitions, and military vehicles. Hitler himself approved the operation, codenamed Unternehmen Mondschein Sonata, Operation Moonlight Sonata. This time, the Luftwaffe would use everything. Knickerbein beams for initial guidance, Excaret for precision targeting, Pathfinder aircraft carrying incendiary bombs to mark targets with fire, and overwhelming numbers, over 500 bombers, the largest night raid yet attempted. British intelligence intercepted German communications days in advance. They knew Coventry was targeted. They knew the date. They faced an impossible choice: evacuate the city, revealing they'd broken German codes, or allow the raid to proceed while attempting to minimize damage through electronic countermeasures. Churchill made the decision. The codes were more valuable than one city. Coventry would not be evacuated, but the electronic warriors would do everything possible to scatter the raid. As bombers crossed the channel, British operators activated every countermeasure station. They bent beams. They injected false signals. They created phantom targets in the electromagnetic spectrum. But Germany had committed too many aircraft. Some were misled. Others, following visual confirmation from Pathfinder fires, hit their marks. Coventry burned for 11 hours. The cathedral was destroyed. Over 500 civilians died. It was a German victory, but it would also be one of their last. The Coventry raid exposed a critical truth.
Electronic warfare could degrade but not completely stop a determined massed attack. Yet even in tragedy, British intelligence gained something vital: detailed understanding of German tactical responses when their navigation systems malfunctioned. Luftwaffe crews, frustrated by intermittent beam reliability, had begun supplementing electronic navigation with visual confirmation. This meant they'd lost confidence in the very technology that gave them their edge. Throughout the winter of 1940–1941, the Invisible War intensified. German engineers constantly modified frequencies, changed transmission patterns, and attempted to identify the source of their navigation problems. Some suspected natural atmospheric interference. Others blamed solar activity. A few whispered about British countermeasures, but were dismissed. The prevailing German belief was that Britain lacked the technical sophistication for such operations. This arrogance was Britain's greatest weapon. Meanwhile, RAF intelligence officers working in the Y service perfected their craft. They could now identify specific German bomber units by their radio operators' distinctive Morse code rhythms. They tracked individual aircraft across the North Sea. They learned to predict targets before bombers even took off, allowing countermeasure stations to prepare precise, targeted interference. The Luftwaffe was fighting an enemy that heard everything, saw through the darkness, and manipulated reality itself. And Germany still refused to believe it was possible. By spring 1941, German bomber effectiveness had dropped by nearly 40%. Crews reported increasing technical difficulties. Navigation equipment malfunctioned at critical moments. Beams seemed to wander during final approach. Some nights, multiple bombers would drop their payloads on the same empty field, each crew certain they'd hit the correct industrial target. Morale suffered. Luftwaffe commanders, once certain they could break Britain through air power alone, began questioning their intelligence reports. Were the targets misidentified? Was the equipment fundamentally flawed? Some pilots requested to return to daylight operations, despite the certainty of facing RAF fighters. The psychological impact was devastating. When technology fails mysteriously, repeatedly, trust evaporates. German aircrews stopped believing their instruments. They second-guessed their training. They looked for targets visually, which meant flying lower, slower, more vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. British cities still burned. Civilians still died. The Blitz continued through May 1941, but the systematic dismantling of British industry that Hitler had planned never materialized. Factories kept producing. Ports remained operational. The island fortress held. And then, suddenly, the night raids stopped. Hitler turned his attention eastward toward the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa would require every bomber, every crew, every resource. The Battle of Britain was over. Germany never realized they'd been defeated by transmitters hidden in the English countryside. The truth emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemicals. After the war, captured German documents revealed the extent to which Britain's electronic countermeasures had sown chaos in Luftwaffe operations. Mission planners had compiled thick files of anomalous navigation incidents, cases where experienced crews reported following proper procedures yet completely missing targets. One Luftwaffe navigator's diary, discovered in 1946, contained a devastating entry from March 1941. "We no longer trust the beams. How can we hit what we cannot find? The English have learned to make the invisible lie." He'd been closer to the truth than his commanders ever acknowledged. Dr. R.V. Jones's post-war analysis showed that British electronic warfare had diverted an estimated 10,000 tons of bombs away from intended targets, roughly 1/5 of all ordnance dropped during the Blitz.
Thousands of bombs fell harmlessly into the North Sea, guided by phantom beams that promised land but delivered only water. More significantly, the operation's success established Britain as the pioneer of electronic warfare. The techniques developed against Knickerbein and Excarot evolved into radar jamming, radio deception, and sophisticated signals intelligence that would be used throughout the remainder of the war. But perhaps the greatest revelation was this. Germany's scientists had actually detected the British interference as early as October 1940. They'd written reports, they'd documented the countermeasures. Their commanders simply refused to believe them.
The refusal to accept the impossible cost Germany the air war. Intercepted post-war testimony from General Josef Kammhuber, chief of the Luftwaffe's Night Fighter Division, confirmed what British intelligence had long suspected. German High Command received multiple warnings about British electronic countermeasures, but dismissed them as excuses for poor crew performance. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, personally rejected reports suggesting the British had defeated German technology. In his worldview, German engineering was superior by definition. If bombers were missing targets, crews must be incompetent or cowardly. This institutional blindness sealed the Luftwaffe's fate. While British electronic warfare teams grew more sophisticated with each raid, German responses remained fragmented and underfunded. Engineers who understood the problem lacked authority. Commanders with authority lacked understanding. By contrast, Britain's approach was revolutionary. Churchill personally chaired meetings where scientists spoke directly to military leadership. Dr. Jones briefed the War Cabinet. Engineers received resources within days of identifying needs. When electronic warfare proved effective, investment increased exponentially. This created a positive feedback loop. Success generated trust. Trust enabled funding. Funding accelerated innovation. Germany's rigid hierarchical structure couldn't adapt quickly enough. By the time Luftwaffe leadership acknowledged the threat, Britain's electronic warfare capabilities were years ahead. The invisible battlefield had tilted permanently. Technology alone hadn't won the battle. Institutional humility and scientific empowerment had.
The final twist came in 1943 when Germany attempted to replicate British countermeasure techniques. They failed catastrophically. German electronic warfare remained defensive and reactive. They could jam Allied radar, but they never achieved the elegant deception that Britain had perfected, the ability to make enemy systems work perfectly while producing incorrect results. The difference was philosophical. German engineers approached electronic warfare as a brute force problem, overwhelm enemy signals with noise. British engineers approached it as a language problem, speak the enemy's language fluently enough to deceive. This distinction shaped everything that followed. When Allied bombers began striking Germany in 1942-1943, British countermeasure technology went with them. Window, strips of aluminum foil that created false radar echoes, blinded German air defenses. Mandrel, airborne radar jamming, created electronic shadows through which bombers flew unseen. The students had become teachers. Britain exported electronic warfare techniques to the United States, Canada, and other allies. The invisible battlefield that Dr. Jones had mapped in 1940 became a global front line. And at the heart of every innovation was a lesson learned during the Blitz. The most powerful weapon isn't always the loudest. Sometimes it's the whisper that sounds exactly like truth while pointing toward oblivion. Germany had taught Britain to listen. Britain had taught them to doubt what they heard. The human cost of the Blitz was staggering. Over 40,000 British civilians died. 1 million homes were destroyed or damaged. Cities bore scars that would take decades to heal. But without electronic warfare, those numbers would have been exponentially worse. Post-war analysis suggested that had German navigation systems worked as designed, Britain's industrial capacity would have been reduced by 60% within 6 months. The war might have ended differently. The scientists who fought this invisible battle received little public recognition. Operations remained classified until the 1970s. Dr. R.V. Jones worked in obscurity throughout the war, his contributions known only to a handful of officials. No medals were struck for the engineers who bent radio beams. No monuments commemorated the Y service operators who listened through endless nights. Yet their legacy defined modern warfare. Today's electronic warfare systems, GPS jamming, communication spoofing, cyber operations, all trace their lineage to those first countermeasure transmitters hidden in English fields. The Luftwaffe crews who survived carried different scars. Many never learned what had truly defeated them. They died believing their equipment had simply failed, that their bombs had fallen wide through misfortune or malfunction. In a way, that was the greatest victory. Britain didn't just defeat German technology. They made Germany defeat itself through doubt, confusion, and the creeping certainty that their instruments could no longer be trusted.
The Battle of the Beams established a truth that modern warfare still wrestles with. Dominance in the electromagnetic spectrum is as critical as dominance in physical space. Today, every military force on Earth employs electronic warfare specialists. GPS satellites can be spoofed, radar can be deceived, communication networks can transmit perfect lies. The techniques pioneered by Dr. Jones and his team in 1940 have evolved into quantum encryption, AI-driven signal intelligence, and cyber operations that can disable entire national infrastructures without firing a shot. But the lesson extends beyond military tactics. The Battle of the Beams proved that innovation flourishes when experts are trusted, when evidence matters more than ego, and when institutions remain humble enough to believe the impossible might be real. Germany lost not because their engineers lacked skill, but because their leaders lacked the wisdom to listen. Britain won not because their technology was superior, but because their system empowered scientists to speak truth to power. In the end, the invisible war was won by people who understood that the most dangerous weapons are often the ones you never see coming, broadcast on frequencies your enemy doesn't believe you can reach, delivering truths that sound like lies and lies that sound like truth. In the darkness above London, the beams still whisper, but now they speak only to history. If this story revealed something you'd never known, share it with someone who loves hidden history. Hit subscribe to uncover more truths that time almost erased. The past is full of secrets, and we're just getting started. Every event, number, and character in this documentary has been verified through historical and documented sources. In the electromagnetic shadows where the invisible war was won, silence became Britain's loudest weapon.